Okay, so let's start with some fundamental facts about God. Whoops, I've gone backwards instead of forwards. So, first fundamental fact about God. God is an infinite entity. Now, there are some logical points that we need to understand as a result of that statement. If God is an infinite entity, can God get bigger? Yes or no? How many say yes? How many say no? 4 of us say no, and we're right. It's impossible for an infinite thing to get bigger. It's already infinite. Interesting thought. Okay, so if God is the infinite oversoul of the universe, then where are we? If something is infinite, where does all other matter fit? Where do you think? Any ideas? Don't they fit inside the infinite? You've never thought about that before, obviously. Right? So what we're stating here, when we talk about God being an infinite God, we're basically stating that God cannot get any bigger or larger. This is one reason why God is unchangeable. Because God is not going to get bigger or larger, he's already infinite. And on top of that, it means that every one of God's qualities has an infinite perspective to it. Right? And in fact, there is a principle that we haven't even put on the list called the infinity principle, which God has designed into every one of God's laws and principles. That infinity is designed as a part of the process because God is an infinite being. It then makes sense that everything God creates has the prospective or the prospect of becoming such, by working towards infinity, if you could call it that way. So this avenue of infinity means, from God's perspective, we are inside God. And from our perspective, we don't see it that way generally, do we? We sort of see ourselves as, we are free-thinking, free-feeling beings. God created it that way. But we think of ourselves as somehow external to God. But it's only an illusion of our own creation. Right. So, very first point, interesting point, right? That God is an infinite being, therefore we exist within God in some way. And we'll describe in some way, because you've got to remember that the universe is multidimensional. So when you talk about multidimensional infinity, you start getting into some pretty complicated mathematical subjects, which we won't cover in our discussion. But it's important for us to understand that we are really within God, even though we have the illusion that we are not. Yeah? But God's still given you the ability to have your own will, to be able to, the capacity to make your own choices and decisions. In some ways, we're a bit like a bacteria inside of a human. Does that make sense? Bacteria still exists, it does its own thing, but it has laws and everything that's inside the human that govern how it can function and operate and where it can live and all those kind of things too. So in some ways we're a bit like that. But of course, God doesn't see you as a bacteria. Yeah, God sees you as the highest, most complex of his creations. So obviously God sees it quite differently. And then we come down to the fact that God has nature or personality or character. So if we imagine this board is infinity, right, then we could say that inside of this infinite being, there are things that we will draw as sort of concentric circles, if you like, as a way of representing them. So we have the outside concentric circle, which is about God's character and God's nature and God's attributes. So, and here we're referring to God's personality, character, attributes and nature. Now, because God is an infinite being, that means that every one of God's character, bit of God's nature or character or attributes have an infinite part to them, which means that when we could say, for example, that God is the personification of wisdom. In other words, God has infinite wisdom. Now, if God has infinite wisdom, we could make this statement, couldn't we? We could say God is wisdom. But that doesn't mean that wisdom is the only thing God is. Does that make sense? So it's not equal to saying that wisdom is God, because that's not true at all. Wisdom is not God, actually. So wisdom actually is not God. Wisdom is just an attribute of God. So we can say God is wisdom because God is the infinite expression of wisdom. But wisdom is not God. Wisdom is just a part of God's attributes, one of many, potentially an infinite number of attributes, actually. You think if you have an infinite being, there is potentially an infinite number of attributes to that being. Which makes sense, right? Or are we starting to already lose you? No, it makes sense. Everyone's right. So if God is wisdom, we can say that is a truth, but we can't say that wisdom is God. Wisdom is not God. Wisdom is just a part of God, one of God's attributes. The same with love. You could say God is love. That is a truth, in that God is the infinite expression of love. But love is not God. Love is just an attribute, a part of God's character, one part of many things that God is. Does everyone get that idea or concept? It's important that you do, because we often unfortunately attribute a characteristic of God, and we start calling that particular characteristic God itself. And this is where humanity often gets into philosophical arguments that are way out of logical reasoning, but also way out of the reality with regard to God's existence. So we could say God is justice, but justice is not God. Justice is just an attribute, a characteristic of God. Yeah? And we can keep going down. God is compassion, but compassion is not God. Compassion is just an attribute of God. Does that make sense? If we think of it that way, we'll start seeing that God is the infinite expression of every possible attribute. But only every possible attribute that comes from God, not attributes that come from humanity. So it would be wrong to say God is anger, because anger does not exist in God. Right? Anger is a human creation based upon suppression, or the desire to suppress emotion. And God doesn't suppress emotion. So therefore God has no anger. So it would be wrong to say God is anger, and anger is definitely not God, or any part of God's attributes. So there are parts of things that we can say belong to God, and then there's other things that definitely do not belong to God. And in fact, if anger belonged to God, the reality is that all of you probably wouldn't be sitting here at the moment. You would all be destroyed because of God's rage. Right? If God was the infinite expression of every quality, and therefore God is the infinite expression of anger, then can you see that he would infinitely express his anger by automatically deleting every possible thing he's ever created? It's a physical impossibility. So there are qualities that don't belong to God at all, that are just human creations. So there's a whole forms of philosophy that say the opposite to that, that if we are able to get angry, then it means God is able to get angry. And in fact, it basically anthropomorphizes God. Is that the word I'm looking for? Yes, making God or turning God into a human, right? And we can't do that. God far exceeds human understanding because we are finite beings. Therefore, we are completely different in some ways to an infinite being. Makes sense, doesn't it? Now, the chances of us ever becoming an infinite being, I would say, are pretty remote, given the fact that if God is an infinite being, how can you have two infinite beings? There's no logical or mathematical sense to that. We will always exist within God. It's just whether we are aware of that or not. Now, the majority of us remain emotionally unaware of that. So here we go. We've got God's nature now. We see that each attribute is completed and perfected in God, and each attribute is not God, but only a part of God. And God's full personality, attributes, character, nature, and desires are infinite. So now we've got some perception, understanding of God herself, God himself. So whenever you're thinking of limitation, we are automatically thinking out of harmony with the way God thinks. To God, there is no limitation anywhere. There is also potentially no limitation to your own full degradation. But God has put into place things, laws, principles that prevent that occurring for your own sake, which we'll talk about later.